This was a place where people lived unbroken for 40,000 years. No total wars, no cities, no empires. And where, in just 3 generations, everything vanishes. Not through a single massacre, not through a single decision. Through law, reports, and good intentions. Before anyone writes in the comments that this is fiction or an AI fantasy, every quote is real. Every letter, report, and name comes from the sources. The bibliography is in the description. Over the next minutes, you will see what extinction looks like. Colonial, legal, polite. Ready? Let's begin. Before they arrived, Tasmania was paradise. I don't use that word lightly. Contemporary travelers wrote of a vast, unspoiled treasury of nature, untouched by anything but the presence of its aborigines. Of primeval forests where no axe had ever sounded. Of trees so ancient they remembered times when humans were only learning to walk upright. Eucalyptus rising 100 meters high. Ferns spreading like canopies. Rivers so clear you could drink straight from the current. Air perfumed with resin and sea salt. The Palawa, for that is what the native inhabitants called themselves, had lived here for over 40,000 years. Before the Egyptians laid the first stone of the pyramids, before the Romans invented concrete, before anyone in Europe learned to write. And then, one day at the start of the 19th century, sails appeared on the horizon, and paradise ended in 3 generations. Let us begin with a letter. On the 3rd of May 1804, the surgeon Jacob Mountgarrett sits by candlelight and writes to the chaplain. An invitation to dinner. His words.
Dear Reverend, it would give me pleasure if you would christen a beautiful native boy I have. Unfortunately, his father and mother have both departed. He's about 2 years old. I also have a man's body. If you would wish to see the dissection, I shall be happy to receive you.
The christening of an orphan and a dissection of a corpse. In a single paragraph, as though it were a dinner menu, appetizer, main course, dessert. Such was the first day of British Tasmania. Where did the surgeon acquire a 2-year-old without parents that evening? And an adult man's body? Let us rewind a few hours. The settlement of Risdon Cove on the Derwent River. Morning. A crowd appears on the hill. 300 people. Men, women, children. They move in a wide arc, driving kangaroos before them. This is a hunt. A traditional drive, people form a crescent and funnel game toward a single point. They had done this for thousands of years. Literally. Lieutenant William Moore watches them from below. He has a handful of soldiers and convicts. The commandant has left. The governor has left. Moore stands alone. Some sources suggest he drank heavily the night before. Hard to blame him. Tasmania at that time was no resort. Moore sees the crowd descending the hill. He orders the carronade loaded, a short naval cannon packed with grape shot. Grape shot is a handful of lead balls that scatter like hail when fired. The soldiers open fire with muskets. Then someone ignites the cannon. The blast carries for kilometers. The shooting continues for 3 hours. A quarter century later, the witness Edward White will stand before a commission and say,
I saw 300 natives coming down the hill, and among them a mob of kangaroos. The natives did not threaten me. I was not afraid of them. They had no spears with them, only waddies, wooden clubs for stunning game. They were hunting. There were hundreds and hundreds of kangaroos.
Hundreds of kangaroos. No war spears. Women. Children. White added one more sentence.
The natives would not have attacked them. They would not have harmed them.
In 72 years, the world would declare that the Tasmanian Aborigines were extinct. That the last Tasmanian was a woman named Truganini. That an entire race had vanished. Naturally, inevitably, the result of a primitive culture meeting a superior civilization. That is a lie. And for the next 90 minutes, I will show you the truth. To understand what the British destroyed, we must go back far. Very far. Kutakina Cave on the Franklin River. 17,000 years before our era. A glacial landscape, temperatures near zero, wind from Antarctica cuts your face like a razor. And in the cave, fires and people. At this moment, They are the southernmost living humans on the planet. No one lives closer to Antarctica. No one. Archaeologists excavated here at the end of the 20th century. From 1% of the deposit, they extracted 75,000 stone tools and 250,000 bone fragments. 1%. The rest still waits beneath the earth. Then came the warming. The ice began to melt. Sea levels rose by 120 meters, the height of a 45-story skyscraper. The lowlands between Tasmania and the continent flooded. Bass Strait was born. Over 200 kilometers of open sea. A few thousand people remained on the island. And the isolation began, the longest in human history. For the next 400 generations, no contact with the rest of the world. No one arrived. No one departed. No new ideas. No foreign diseases. No news of the world beyond the horizon. When the Egyptians were building the pyramids, these people had already been isolated for 5,000 years. When Columbus reached America, they still did not know that beyond their island, other humans existed. Does this mean they regressed? That they lived in some frozen Paleolithic state? Some claim so. The archaeologist Rhys Jones wrote in the 1970s of a slow strangulation of the mind, of cultural regression. It fit the colonial narrative of savages who had condemned themselves to extinction. The problem is that Jones was wrong. Studies of the Emerald Swamp wetlands reveal a sudden spike in charcoal deposits from over 40,000 years ago, the oldest evidence on Earth of controlled forest burning. For tens of thousands of years, the Palawa transformed dense rainforests into open savannas and mosaic grasslands. To hunt more easily, to attract kangaroos to fresh grass, to control their environment. This is not primitivism. This is ecological engineering on a continental scale. Today, ecologists learn this technique from Aborigines to fight bushfires. They call it cool burning, controlled fires that clear underbrush without destroying trees, and their oral traditions. They contain descriptions of astronomical phenomena from 12,000 years ago. Stories of the star Moni, Canopus, the second brightest in the sky, that correspond to calculations by modern astronomers accounting for the precession of Earth's axis, the slow wobble of our planet that shifts star positions over thousands of years. 400 generations passed these stories down, without writing. Only memory and the discipline of storytelling. There was another detail that astonished Europeans. Palawa women dove into the freezing waters of Bass Strait, harvesting abalone, edible shellfish, a type of large sea snail, and lobsters from the seabed. Naked, in temperatures near zero, for hours. Their bodies were covered in scars from sharp rocks and shells. And the men? Many could not swim. Europeans could not comprehend this. How could women dive in freezing water while men feared the waves? It made sense. Division of labor. Men hunted on land, kangaroos, wombats, possums. Women gathered food from the sea. Each did what they did best. Each had their domain. They created 9 distinct nations, with their own territories and languages, between 8 and 12 different ones, mutually unintelligible. As if on an island the size of Ireland, Poland, Hungary, and Finland existed side by side. On the eastern coast lived the Oyster Bay Nation, the Paradarem. 700 to 800 people, over 10 clans. That is where Truganini came from. In the island center, the Big River Nation, the largest territory, 8,000 square kilometers, the only one without access to the sea. They lived by hunting kangaroos and wombats in high mountain valleys. On the northwest, the people who would, in a few decades, become victims of the Cape Grim tragedy. And in the southwest, a nation numbering just 200 to 300 souls, hidden in the densest rainforests on Earth, the last to encounter whites. They had no bows, no arrows, no ceramics, metal, dogs, or boomerangs. They had something Europeans did not understand. They had time. 40,000 years of perfecting the art of survival and passing stories around the fire. All of this the British Empire resolved to erase from the face of the earth. And it began with a simple assumption, that this land belonged to no one. Why did the British come here at all? The answer is prosaic. Fear of the French. The era of the Napoleonic Wars. France was looking for Pacific bases. Tasmania lay on strategic sea routes. London decided, occupy it before someone else does. Besides, the French had already been there. 3 decades earlier, the Marion Dufresne expedition landed on Tasmania's coast. Within hours, there was a clash. The French killed at least 1 Aborigine. First contact between Europe and Tasmania. First blood. The British arrived with a doctrine that would justify everything that followed. Terra nullius. Land belonging to no one. The Palawa had no fences, no herds, no concept of land ownership in the European sense. So one could pretend the land was empty, that it awaited its rightful owners, that no one had lived here before them. It is as though someone entered your house and declared that since you have no deed, the house belongs to no one. And you may, at best, remain as a tenant or disappear. In September 1803, Lieutenant John Bowen founded the first settlement at Risdon Cove. 80 people, soldiers, convicts, a few free settlers. Most were exhausted. Food shipments from India and England often arrived spoiled, or did not arrive at all. That winter? Officials called it a period near famine. Under such conditions, a few months later, came the massacre you already know, the one from the beginning of our story. Moore opened fire on hunters on the hill and changed the island's history. For the first dozen years or so, the colony grew slowly. 2,000 white inhabitants, a few settlements along the rivers, apparent coexistence with the Aborigines, because there was enough land for everyone. Then came the turning point. Wool. The Industrial Revolution in England created massive demand for textile material. Factories in Lancashire needed wool like oxygen, and Tasmania proved ideal, cooler climate than the mainland, vast pastures, gentle hills, and no competition from the native population, at least in the colonists' eyes. Ships carrying settlers began pouring in. Within a decade, the white population grew 8-fold, from 3,000 to 23,000. And with the people came sheep. 38,000, then 300,000, then nearly 1 million. 1 million sheep on an island the size of Ireland. The Van Diemen's Land Company, a powerful corporation from London, received a concession for 125,000 hectares in the northwest. For one company alone. Investors in London counted profits. No one asked whose land it was. Those pastures were Palawa hunting grounds for thousands of years. The kangaroos that lived there were the basis of their diet, their main source of protein. Sheep ate the grass that kangaroos fed on. Settlers shot kangaroos to protect pastures. And without kangaroos, the Palawa had nothing to eat. Before war over land erupted, something worse arrived. At the end of the 18th century, the waters around Tasmania teemed with seals. For European fur traders, a gold mine. Seals fought over rocks in such numbers that you could simply walk up and club them. Pelts sold for fortunes in China and Europe. Men who can only be called sea pirates began arriving. Escaped convicts from Australian penal colonies, sailors deserting ships, outcasts with no one watching over them. They lived on remote islands in Bass Strait, without law, without oversight, without rules. And they quickly discovered that besides seals, these islands held something even more valuable: women. The missionary George Augustus Robinson, you will hear much more of him, kept journals. For years he collected testimony from survivors. Seal hunters shot Aboriginal men sitting by their fires, then abducted the women. Robinson used the word slaves. In the official journal of a Christian mission, a woman named Warrata Mutariena was abducted by the seal hunter George Briggs, roughly 10 years after the colony's founding. She was then sold to another hunter. For 1 guinea, perhaps 2 weeks' wages for a labourer. Then, along with other abducted women, she was taken to uninhabited islands in the Indian Ocean, thousands of kilometres from home, and abandoned there. Bulra from Cape Portland told Robinson directly, "White men tie us up and then flog us very hard. Much blood, much crying." Her own words. In the English she learned in captivity. The English observer H.W. Parker described a seal hunter named Harrington. Harrington obtained 10 or 15 native women and placed them on different islands in Bass Strait. He compelled them to hunt seals. If, when he returned, they had not obtained enough skins, he punished them by tying them to trees for 24 to 36 hours, flogging them at intervals. And he not infrequently terminated their existence if they proved obstinate. The Irishman Brian abducted a mother with her child. He called the woman a bitch, the child a pup. His words were recorded. "Since I stole the bitch, I'll keep the pup." That is how he spoke of human beings. A few years later, a group of Quakers, a pacifist religious sect, visited Tasmania. They met an Aboriginal woman who decided to show them what had been done to her. Without words, only gestures. She showed marks of being stripped, stretched out her arms high up against the wall in the attitude of a prisoner tied up for flogging, gave a piteous cry, representing a person striking her on the back and legs, and she falling to the ground. Falling to the ground. A wordless demonstration. Before people who had come from the other end of the world. By the early 1830s, Robinson noted that in northeastern Tasmania, among 72 men, only 3 women remained. 3. The rest had been abducted. And what did colonial authorities do? The Colonial Times newspaper wrote plainly, "The government must remove the natives. If not, they will be hunted down like wild beasts and destroyed." Hunted down like wild beasts. This is not language from Nazi Germany. This is the language of colonial Tasmania in the 1820s. There was another element of terror that official history silenced for years. Convicts. Governor George Arthur ran a system of assigned service. Convicts were sent to work for settlers as cheap labor. Hundreds ended up on remote farms as shepherds. Solitary men, without supervision, without moral rules, often brutal. After all, they had not landed in penal colonies for picking flowers. And these men began doing the same thing as the seal hunters. Night raids on Palawa camps. Abduction of women and girls. Historians call it gin raiding, from the word gin, which in colonial slang meant an Aboriginal woman. These were the direct triggers of war. The choice was simple: fight or starve. Fight or watch as your daughters and sisters are taken. One man chose to fight, and for 7 years, he was never caught. Tongalongata, remember that name. Chief of the Oyster Bay Nation, the Poor Darame clan. He was around 30 when the British began occupying the eastern coast. Over the next decade, he lost everything. His brother was captured and hanged. His wife was abducted during a night raid on their camp. Most of his relatives died from bullets or vanished into the hands of hunters. He himself survived an attack. He described it to Robinson in his own words. "The men got frightened and ran away. At night, they returned with plenty of white men. There was a moon, they saw our fires. Then they shot at us, shot my arm, killed 2 men and 3 women. They struck the women on the head. Struck the women on the head." He could have surrendered. He did not. Together with the chief of the Big River Nation, Montpeliata, he united the survivors into a single fighting alliance. Together, they had perhaps 200 people capable of combat. Against them stood over 20,000 whites, a ratio of 100 to 1. Compare the weapons. The British Empire at the height of its power, regular infantry regiments armed with Brown Bess muskets, the standard British infantry weapon, the same that defeated Napoleon, mounted police, field artillery, a supply chain from the metropole. Facing them, a handful of men with spears tipped with sharp stone and wooden clubs. No firearms, no horses, no allies. On paper, this should not have been a war. It should have been swift pacification. A month, maybe 2. And yet, for 7 years, a handful of warriors held an entire colony in fear. How was this possible? Historians Nicholas Clements and Henry Reynolds wrote, "Raised from infancy in the arts of war, Aboriginal warriors conducted guerrilla operations with remarkable discipline and strategy. They employed reconnaissance, decoys, flanking and pincer maneuvers, sabotage and arson. They usually surrounded a hut, eliminated the occupants, looted what they wanted, and set it ablaze. Then they simply vanished, evading even mounted pursuit. Simply vanished, because they knew every ravine, every cave, every mountain pass. Whites looked at the bush and saw a chaotic labyrinth. Tongalongata looked and saw home, where he knew every corner. Over 7 years, the Oyster Bay Big River Alliance conducted over 700 attacks. They killed 182 colonists, wounded another 176, 354 casualties in total, 4% of the island's entire white population. 4%. Proportionally, more than Australia lost in any subsequent war, including both world wars. The Colonial Times wrote of fear and terror among settlers. Farmers abandoned remote huts. Women and children fled to towns. Tongalongata was not alone. He had allies. Mosquito. He was not a Tasmanian. He came from the Guy Mariagal clan near Sydney. The British deported him to Tasmania as a tracker. He was supposed to help catch escaped convicts, bushrangers who fled into the bush and robbed travellers. He was promised that after completing his task, he would return to his people. The promise was never kept. He united a group of several dozen scattered Aborigines and launched his own war. Newspapers called him the Black Napoleon. The governor placed a reward of £100 on his head, a year's wages for an ordinary labourer. He was captured and hanged. The evidence, as historian Naomi Parry later wrote, was dubious. The verdict, however, was predetermined. His execution was meant to frighten the rest. It did not. It strengthened the resistance. And then there was Taranora. I must tell you more about this woman. Robinson called her the Amazon of Van Diemen's Land. Her story begins like a nightmare. Abducted as a teenager by seal hunters, sold for flour and dogs, literally, that was her worth. For years, she lived in captivity on the islands of Bass Strait, forced to hunt seals for her captors. In captivity, she learned 2 things: English and how to operate a musket. She watched how whites loaded their weapons, how they aimed, how they fired, how they cleaned the barrel and replaced the flint. She memorized every movement. She escaped, and she started a war. She gathered warriors of both sexes. Yes, women fought too. She conducted the first documented use of firearms by Aborigines in Tasmania. She personally trained people in the use of muskets captured from settlers. Robinson recorded her method of operation. She would stand on a hill to organize the attack, abusing the settlers and challenging them to come and get speared. She provoked, drew them out of their fortifications. Then her people struck from the flanks. Asked what she thought of white men, she answered that she liked white men as much as black snakes. Snakes in Tasmania are venomous. Their bite kills. Robinson recorded that nearly all the damage done to various settlers in the island's north could be attributed to her warriors. Nearly all. There was also Kikaturpola, known to the British as Black Tom Birch. He did something no one else dared. He stood before Governor Arthur himself and said to his face, "Aboriginal attacks were justified. The people were hungry and considered themselves not perpetrators but victims." Not perpetrators. Victims. Arthur listened and did nothing. On the other side of the conflict stood John Batman, commander of hunting parties, official armed groups sent by the governor to hunt Aborigines. Yes, hunting. That is what they called it, as though dealing with game, not people. Later, Batman would found Melbourne and enter Australian textbooks as a pioneer and hero. Governor Arthur described him as having many massacres on his conscience. His neighbour, the painter John Glover, said plainly, "A rogue, thief, cheat and liar, the most wretchedest man I ever knew." On the 1st of September, 1829, Batman leads a night attack on a camp in the Ben Lomond district. 60 to 70 people, men, women, children, from his own report to police. They were in the act of fleeing into the thick bush when I ordered the men to fire upon them, which was done. We only captured that night one woman and a boy about 2 years old. The captured woman was named Luganimanana, the boy, Rolapana. 2 wounded men could not walk. Batman recorded in his report. I found that those 2 absolutely could not walk. I was therefore obliged to shoot them. Obliged to shoot them. That is how he described it. In an official document. 2-year-old Rolapana was placed with Batman as a ward, a euphemism for household slave. The colonial government demanded the child's return. Batman refused. He took the boy with him to Melbourne when he founded that city. No consequences. For anyone. At some point, a musket ball struck Tongalongata in the arm. The wound was so severe it required amputation. There was no doctor, no surgical instruments, no anesthetics. His tribesmen cut off his arm above the elbow and cauterized the stump with red-hot wood to stop the bleeding. He survived. He continued to lead. A one-armed partisan against the British Empire. Historians wrote, armed only with spears and clubs, they mounted the toughest resistance of any people in Australia. They fought until only a few dozen remained. The turning point of the war was approaching. Cape Grim, northwestern Tasmania. All around, rocks, sea, cold wind from Antarctica. Waves crash against a cliff 60 meters below. 30 people from the Penamukia clan sit by their fires. They are hunting mutton birds, young seabirds that emerge from their burrows in this season. Fat chicks full of oil, a traditional delicacy for generations. They have prepared a store of birds, tied them with seagrass. They sit, they eat, they talk. Children play by the fire. Women nurse infants. From the landward side, 4 shepherds of the Van Diemen's Land Company approach. They have muskets. Robinson later gathered witness accounts. The whole tribe was sitting around their fires, eating their hard-won meal, when suddenly a band of wild, bloodthirsty barbarians rushed upon them. Some threw themselves into the sea. Others scrambled around the cliff. And those who remained, the monsters ended their lives and cast their bodies down. 60 meters. Below, rocks and sea. Robinson later spoke with Charles Chamberlain, one of the perpetrators, a convict shepherd. He asked directly, "How many?" 30. Edward Kerr, chief manager of the Van Diemen's Land Company, later claimed the victims numbered 3 to 6. He was trying to protect the company. Investors in London disliked scandals. No one faced consequences. A few months later, at Jordan Lagoon. A summer day, heat. A group of Aborigines bathes in the lake, unarmed, naked. Pastor John Dunmore Lang saw the place many years later. He recorded, 17 were killed in cold blood. They were bathing in the heat of a summer's day when they were suddenly surprised. Bathing. In the heat. Unarmed. The Colonial Times reported another tragedy. The people beyond Western Tier killed a great number of blacks last week. They were surrounded while sitting by their fires, the soldiers firing on them from about 30 yards distant. About 60 must have been killed and wounded. The same newspaper, hunting parties brought home numerous trophies, such as spears, clubs, tomahawks. Trophies, as from a safari. Rosalie Hare, wife of a ship captain stationed at Circular Head, recorded in her private journal, "We must lament that our countrymen consider killing these people an honor. They wish to exterminate them entirely if possible." Exterminate them entirely. The missionary Roland Hassel once asked, "Why are no natives seen in town?" The answer, "We shoot them whenever we find them." James Gumm, a shepherd, described to the historian James Bonwick the tragedy at Sally Peak. They moved silently until they surrounded the sleepers. The commander's whistle sounded, and volley after volley poured into the dark groups around the small fires. British reports document worse things. One group finished off women and children, dragging them from crevices in the rocks and smashing their heads. Researchers from Yale noted colonists who seized Aboriginal children and smashed their skulls, and lined up Aborigines as targets for shooting practice. Shooting practice, with living people. Governor Arthur was aware of the situation. In November 1828, he declared martial law. The proclamation was unprecedented. All Aborigines found in settled districts were deemed open enemies of the king. Soldiers received the right to eliminate anyone on the spot, without trial, without questions. Martial law remained in force for over 3 years, the longest period in Australian history. Arthur also ordered proclamation boards hung in the bush, about 100 painted planks with pictures, comics for the illiterate hung on trees in the forest. The pictures showed a white man and a black man shaking hands, raising children together, and at the bottom, 2 panels, a white man hanged for killing an Aborigine and an Aborigine hanged for killing a white man. Equality before the law. In pictures for those who cannot read. The problem? Throughout the colony's entire history, not a single white person was tried or executed for killing an Aborigine. Not one. The boards proclaimed justice that did not exist. Like an advertisement for a restaurant that had burned down. Arthur also introduced a bounty system. £5 for a captured adult Aborigine, alive. £2 for a child. In today's money, over £500 for an adult. Over $200 for a child. A price on a human head. One station owner, William Knight, was, according to an account given to Robinson, known for killing Aborigines for sport. Edward Kerr, manager of the Van Diemen's Land Company, reportedly offered rum to anyone who brought him an Aboriginal head. And Tongalongata still fought. Colonists were terrified. Farmers abandoned remote huts. Women and children fled to towns. Arthur organized more and more hunting parties. By the following spring, nearly 200 armed men in 23 separate groups were combing the districts. It was not enough. So Arthur decided to try something no one had attempted before. Mobilize the entire colony. Autumn of 1830. Arthur is cornered. Attacks continue. London demands a solution to the native problem. Previous methods have failed. Tongalongata and Montpeliata remain at large. Arthur makes his decision. He orders the largest military operation in Australian history, the Black Line. October. Over 2,200 men, soldiers from 4 regiments, police, 700 convicts, free settlers, form a cordon 300 kilometers long. From the mountains in the west to the coast in the east. 10% of Tasmania's entire white population stands in that line. 1 in 10 white residents of the island. The plan is simple. The cordon will advance south, combing the bush step by step. All Aborigines will be driven onto the Tasman Peninsula, a narrow cape connected to the rest of the island by an isthmus a few hundred meters wide. From there, no escape. Arthur commands personally. He announces, the community is called upon to make a general muster on the 7th of October for the capture of those hostile tribes of natives. The operation costs £30,000, half the colony's annual revenue. For 7 weeks, the cordon advances south. Soldiers fire muskets continuously to terrorize the Aborigines and flush them from hiding. The roar of gunfire echoes through the mountains day and night. The result? 2 people captured, an old man and a boy. 2 from the entire operation. Tongalongata, Montpeliata, and their people passed through the line. At night, through gaps in the cordon. Using ravines and swamps the whites did not know. Using the fact that exhausted settlers fell asleep at their posts. Using the fog. At the same time, while 2,000 people tried to catch them, Oyster Bay warriors conducted more attacks. 5 colonists killed, 6 wounded. The Black Line entered history as one of the most spectacular military failures in the history of the British Empire. Newspapers in Hobart joked that the operation's only trophy was an old dingo caught in the forest. 2,200 people, 7 weeks, £30,000, and a dingo. Arthur was not about to give up. If force would not work, he would try cunning. Enter the man who would change Tasmania's fate, and whose role remains controversial to this day. George Augustus Robinson. Robinson's plan was simple. Instead of chasing Aborigines with weapons, he would find them, persuade them to lay down their arms, and escort them to a safe place, away from settlers, under imperial protection. Robinson had something the military detachments lacked: Aboriginal guides, people who knew the terrain, the languages, the customs, who could reach places whites would never find. One of these guides was Truganini. She was then in her 20s. She came from the Nuanon Nation on Bruny Island, near Hobart. Her story up to this point was a stream of tragedy. Her mother, killed by sailors. Her uncle, shot by a soldier. Her 2 sisters, abducted by seal hunters and never found. And her betrothed? Murdered by loggers. When he tried to climb back into the boat to save her, they cut off his hands. He fell into the water and drowned. And then they violated her. Truganini had every reason to hate whites, and yet she joined Robinson's mission. Why? Because she saw what was happening. She saw her people dying. She saw the war was lost. And she believed, wanted to believe, that Robinson spoke the truth. That if her people laid down their arms, they would be safe. She later said, "I had hoped we could save all of my people who remained. There was no point fighting any longer." She herself saved Robinson's life twice during expeditions. She swam with him across rushing rivers. He could not swim, and she pulled him out every time. Freezing water, roaring current, she naked, he in soaked clothes, clinging to her arms. What did she receive in return? Robinson recorded that he gave her a few clothes as a bonus. A few clothes, for saving his life twice. For the next years, Truganini, Robinson, her husband Wuradi, and several other guides traversed the wildest corners of Tasmania. On foot, through mountains, rainforests, swamps. Hundreds of kilometers. They found hidden groups. They talked. They persuaded. Robinson made promises. In his journals he recorded, the people were guaranteed tea, flour, sugar, clothing, and protection from being shot, together with the promise that they would be returned to their homes as soon as the danger had passed. That they would be returned to their homes. That was a promise, made to specific people, recorded in a journal that survives to this day. Was it kept? No. Robinson was effective, far more effective than the Black Line. One by one, exhausted groups, weary from fighting, hungry, decimated by disease, agreed to go with him. Even Tonga surrendered at last. New Year's Eve, 1831. Remote mountains of central Tasmania. Cold. Fog. 25 people remain, the remnants of the Oyster Bay Big River Alliance. Women, children, elders, a handful of warriors. Tonga Longetta, with one arm, exhausted, emaciated. His wife Drumti Metio was pregnant. Robinson arrived with a group of Aboriginal emissaries. Among them was Kikatapala, a former comrade in arms of Tonga Longetta, who had earlier laid down his weapons. They negotiated for days. Robinson made promises. He spoke of peace, of safety, of returning home. Tonga Longetta agreed. What could he do? 25 people against 23,000. One arm. Hungry children. Winter at the door. In early January, crowds gathered on the streets of Hobart. Word had spread that the last wild Aborigines had been brought in. People wanted to see the enemy who had robbed them of sleep for years. And they saw. Tonga Longetta with one arm. Montpeliata. A handful of emaciated men, women, and children. This was the end of the Black War. Not the end of the story, Robinson recorded in his journal. Taking the entire group, I gained not only a reward, but also fame. Not only a reward, but also fame. That is how he thought of the people he had promised to save. And indeed, Robinson profited. Altogether, about £8,000 for his friendly missions, an enormous fortune for those times. He also received a land grant. Later, he became Chief Protector of Aborigines in the Port Phillip colony, today's Melbourne. He bought property in South Yarra. He died in England, in a house high on a hill, far from Flinders Island, far from the graves of the people he had promised return. What did Robinson promise? Tea, flour, sugar, clothing, protection, and a return home. What did they receive? Flinders Island, a chunk of rocky land 80 kilometers northeast of Tasmania, in the middle of Bass Strait. Exposed to the winds, without shelter, with poor water and barren soil. Here, at a place called Wyberlena, they created a camp. Over the following years, nearly all Aborigines gathered from Tasmania were sent here. Between 120 and 220 people, sources vary, the remnants of 9 nations. People torn from their lands, separated from their families, crammed into a few cramped barracks. Conditions were nightmarish. A few months after the camp opened, over 100 people shared 4 rooms. An official's report stated, neither warm nor dry, the water was undrinkable, the soil barren, the food insufficient. One visiting official wrote plainly, the inhabitants of Wyberlena are being deliberately exterminated. Deliberately exterminated. His words, not mine. People who had lived for thousands of years in open spaces, hunting and wandering, were confined to barracks. Hunting was forbidden. Traditional ceremonies were forbidden. Their own names were forbidden, changed to English ones. Their language was forbidden. They were forced to wear European clothes and attend church. And those clothes? The Palawa had for thousands of years rubbed their bodies with animal fat mixed with ochre, a natural red-brown mineral pigment, as protection against cold and damp. Now they were told to wear cotton, wet cotton that, in the island's humid climate, almost never dried. They began dying of pneumonia, en masse. The commandant's pigs entered residents' huts and ate their food rations. Dogs belonging to Aborigines, the only remnant of their former lives, were shot or taken to a deserted island and abandoned to certain death. Children were taken from their parents, officially to give them a Christian upbringing. Robert Clark, the catechist, a religious teacher, responsible for the children, used flogging. A girl named Mathina later testified, I was in the care of Mr. and Mrs. Clark when I was flogged. I was laid on a table and my hands and legs were tied. I was flogged every day. I was once flogged so that the blood ran down my head. The blood ran down my head. A child's words, recorded in an official document. Another girl, Fanny Cochran, whom you will hear of again, lived under Clark in conditions of horrifying filth, neglect, and brutality. She once tried to set his house on fire to escape. People died, year after year, from disease, from hunger, from despair. Children were scarcely born, and those who came into the world did not survive. Infant mortality approached 100%. Chief Manalagena of Cape Portland, a man Robinson described as a person of higher intelligence, arrived on the island in autumn. Robinson had promised him earlier that he would not be sent to Flinders Island. When Manalagena saw the promise had been broken, he did something symbolic. He cut off his long, ochred hair and beard. These were symbols of warrior status. He had worn them his whole life. To cut them meant to cease being himself. A month later, Manalagena was dead. And Tonga Longeta? The great warrior who had held an entire colony in fear for years. After 5 years at Wyberlena, he demanded of Robinson, "Let us leave this place of sickness." Robinson hesitated. Tonga Longeta then asked him a question. It was recorded word for word. "What, are you going to stay until all the black men are dead? Are you going to stay until all the black men are dead?" 3 months later, Tonga Longeta was dead, on the same day as King William IV in distant England. He was buried in the cemetery at Wyberlena, without a headstone, without a marker. Today, his grave is overgrown with thistle. Before their deaths, however, the Palawa did something unprecedented. 8 men from Wyberlena wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. This was the first petition sent by Australia's Indigenous people to a reigning monarch. The document survives to this day. Here are excerpts. The humble petition of the free Aborigines of Van Diemen's Land, now living on Flinders Island. We humbly declare that we, your Royal Highness's petitioners, are your free children. That we were not taken into captivity, but gave up our country to Colonel Arthur, then governor, of our own free will. Mr. Robinson made with us and Colonel Arthur an agreement that we have kept, but they have not. We have kept, they have not. And further, about Dr. Jeanneret, the camp's commandant at the time. We pray that your Royal Highness will not let Dr. Jeanneret come back to us. He carried pistols in his pockets and threatened to shoot us. Our houses were falling down and were never cleaned but covered in vermin. 11 of us departed when he was here. He put many of us in jail for talking to him, because we would not be his slaves. We would not be his slaves. The petition was signed by, among others, Walter George Arthur, a ward of a school for convicts in Hobart who had learned to read and write English. What did Queen Victoria do? She received the petition very graciously. The Secretary of State for the Colonies questioned the point of maintaining the settlement. It appears that the natives were removed from Van Diemen's Land, not so much for their own benefit as with a view to the interests of the colonists. Not for their benefit, but with a view to the interests of the colonists. Even London could see it. A year later, Wyberlena was closed. How many survived? 47. 15 men, 22 women, 10 children. From the several thousand Palawa who lived in Tasmania before the whites arrived, after over 4 decades of colonization, 47 remained. They were transferred to Oyster Cove, an old whaling station south of Hobart, former prison barracks. There they were to live out their days. And Governor Arthur? The one who had declared martial law and the proclamation boards? He wrote later, "It was a fatal error in the first settlement of Van Diemen's Land that a treaty was not entered into with the natives, which must forever remain a stain upon the colonization of Van Diemen's Land." A stain, his word. He admitted the error, but only when nothing could be undone. What I will tell you now is difficult, but true. In the 19th century, Aboriginal bodies were commodities. European science, phrenology, the pseudoscience claiming that skull shape revealed intelligence and character, as well as racial anatomy, desperately craved specimens from primitive races. Skulls, skeletons, skin, everything had value. And the last full-blooded Tasmanian? That was the grand prize. Morton Allport, Vice President of the Royal Society of Tasmania, a respected lawyer, described himself as the chief exporter of bodily remains of Tasmanian Aborigines to Europe. Chief exporter, his words. Allport sent skulls and skeletons to the Royal College of Surgeons in England, to the Anthropological Society of London, to the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences. Prices: skulls sold for 5 to 10 shillings, a complete skeleton, much more. How many remains were removed? Historians estimate that about 50,000 Aboriginal remains were stored in medical institutions outside Australia. 10,000 bodies were sent to British museums. 10,000. Just recently, the University of Aberdeen returned to Australia the skull of a young man shot by the Shannon River. His killers themselves severed his head and sold it to collectors. Nearly 200 years later, he came home. But the most macabre story concerns William Lann. In the Dog and Partridge pub in Hobart sat a man. He was in his early 30s. His name was William Lann, though most knew him as King Billy. He was a whaler. He had spent his life on boats hunting whales in the South Pacific. Sailors liked him for his cheerful disposition. William Lann was something else too. In the white world's eyes, he was the last full-blooded Aboriginal man from Tasmania. A year earlier, during a regatta in Hobart, the governor had introduced him to the Duke of Edinburgh as the King of the Tasmanians. On the 3rd of March, 1869, William Lann died. The official cause, cholera, and the effects of years of drinking. His body was taken to the hospital morgue, and here the horror begins. 2 institutions raced for Lann's body. The Royal College of Surgeons in London, the mightiest medical institution in the empire, and the Royal Society of Tasmania, the local scientific society. Dr. William Crowther, a surgeon, member of the Royal College, later Premier of Tasmania, applied to the government for permission to send the skeleton to London. He was refused. Crowther was not about to give up. On the night after Land's death, he broke into the morgue. By candlelight, he severed William Land's head. He boiled the skull to separate flesh from bone. And to hide the evidence, he took a skull from another body, that of a white schoolteacher named Thomas Ross, and placed it where the Aboriginal skull had been. The skin was stitched up. No one noticed. Dr. George Stokell of the Royal Society, however, suspected something. The next day, he conducted his own inspection of the body. He discovered the substitution. And he resolved not to be outdone. That same night, Stokell returned to the morgue with his men. They severed Land's hands and feet. A certain John Woodcock Graves hid the severed limbs in his coat pockets and carried them outside. Then came the funeral. Official, public, with honours for the last king. That same night, someone dug up the grave. When people checked the next day to see what remained, they found Thomas Ross's skull abandoned among the headstones. Of William Lann, according to a press account, only a few scraps of flesh were left. Dr. Crowther later claimed that Lann's brain showed the improvement that occurs in a lower race subjected to the influences of civilization. Improvement in a lower race. That is how he spoke of a man whose skull he had stolen. What consequences did Crowther face? He lost his honorary position as hospital surgeon. That same year, however, the Royal College of Surgeons in London awarded him a gold medal and the first membership ever granted to an Australian. A decade later, William Crowther became Premier of Tasmania. In May 2024, over 150 years later, someone toppled Crowther's statue in Hobart at night. On the pedestal they wrote, "What goes around," and "Decolonize." Truganini saw what was done to her partner's body. She knew she was next. She was then nearly 60. She was one of the last residents of Oyster Cove. Year after year, one after another departed. Disease, old age, despair. In the end, she was almost alone. She was moved to Hobart. The world began taking interest in her. The press called her the last Tasmanian. Scholars and photographers visited her regularly. They wanted to see the last representative of an extinct race. Truganini knew what they really wanted. The Royal Society of Tasmania obtained government permission for exhumation, on condition, as the official document stated, that the remains not be put on public display. A decade later, Truganini's skull was exhibited at the Centennial Exhibition in Melbourne. From the beginning of the 20th century, for over 40 years, Truganini's complete skeleton stood at the entrance to the Tasmanian Museum. Behind glass, anyone could come and look. Only after World War II did the museum end the display. But the skeleton remained in the collection for another 30 years. Truganini's remains were cremated only 100 years after her passing. The ashes were scattered the next day in the D'Entrecasteaux Channel, in waters she had known since childhood. 100 years she waited for her last wish to be fulfilled. Truganini, however, was not the last. For 100 years, the world believed the Tasmanian Aborigines were extinct, that Truganini was the last, that an entire race had vanished, naturally, inevitably, the result of a primitive culture meeting a superior civilization. That is a lie, because the Palawa never died out. Throughout the 19th century, in the shadow of official history, there existed a community no one wanted to acknowledge. The children and grandchildren of Aboriginal women abducted by seal hunters in the colony's first decades. Women who survived on the islands of Bass Strait, who started families with white or black men, who passed their culture to the next generations. On Cape Barren Island, on the Furneaux Islands, the Palawa lived on. They fished, hunted seals, practiced their ancestors' traditions, but colonial authorities did not want to see them. Tasmania's official policy for over a century held, since the last full-blooded Aborigine had died, the rest were not true natives. Descendants of mixed unions had no right to Aboriginal status, no right to land, no right to distinctiveness. Reserves were created for them, that they could not leave without government permission. As late as the 1950s, a ban remained in force, preventing Tasmanian half-castes from settling on the main island of Tasmania. They thought the problem would solve itself, that in a generation or two, no one would remember. They were wrong. Remember Fanny Cochrane, the girl who tried to set fire to Catechist Clark's house to escape? She survived Wyberlena. She survived Oyster Cove. She married, had 11 children. Many contemporary Tasmanian Aborigines are her descendants. At the end of her life, aged 65, Fanny Cochrane Smith stood before a phonograph, one of the first sound recording devices. A large cylinder on which a needle etched marks in wax, and she recorded songs in the language of her ancestors. These are the only existing recordings of an original Tasmanian language. When she heard her own voice played back from the cylinder, she wept. She said, "My poor people, what have I done?" At the beginning of the recording, you can hear her words, "I am Fanny Smith. I was born on Flinders Island. I am the last of the Tasmanians." She was not the last. Yet her whole life, she had been told she was. Her recordings survived. And today, over 120 years later, linguists use them to reconstruct the language. Palawakani has emerged, a revived Tasmanian language built from over 1,000 words extracted from Fanny's recordings, from Robinson's journals, from the notes of 19th century researchers. Palawakani is now taught in schools. It is used in official place names. You can hear it at ceremonies. In the 1970s, the Aboriginal Information Service was established. A new generation of Palawa descendants began loudly demanding recognition. Michael Mansell, a lawyer and activist, said, "We survived as a nation. Our blood is Tasmanian. Our identity is Palawa." How many are there today? By various estimates, between 6,000 and 23,000 people in Tasmania identify as Aboriginal. More than before colonisation, according to some historians. And what of the warriors who did not surrender even after the Black War ended? Tunaminawait and Morboyhina. Two names you should remember. Both fought in the Black War. Both were captured and sent to Wyberlena. Both had had enough. Robinson took a group of Tasmanians to the Port Phillip colony, today's Melbourne. They were to be a living advertisement of his success. A display of civilized savages at banquets and receptions. Tunaminawait and Morboyhina had other plans. They escaped into the bush. For several months, they waged a guerrilla campaign in Gippsland. They attacked settlers' stations. They captured weapons and supplies. They showed that the spirit of resistance had not died. Eventually, they were captured. On the 20th of January, 1842, Tunaminawait and Morboyhina were hanged in Melbourne. They were the first people executed in that city. The first. The city founded by John Batman, the same man who was obliged to shoot wounded Aborigines, began its history with the execution of Palawa warriors. 3,000 people came to watch. Resistance continued even after the war ended, even after Wyberlena, even after they were officially declared defeated. Let us return to Tongalongeta. To his question, "Are you going to stay until all the black men are dead?" The black men did not die. The British Empire did everything to remove them. It shot them with cannons. It drove them from their lands. It confined them in camps. It forbade their language, their religion, their names. It stole their bodies after death. It displayed their skeletons in museums. It declared them extinct and repeated that lie for 100 years. And they survived. Truganini wore a bright red cap to the end of her life. It was her adaptation of the traditional ochre her people applied to their hair, a small sign that she remembered who she was. In the cemetery at Wyberlena, where Tongalongeta lies with hundreds of others, there are no monuments, no markers, only thistle and wind from the sea. But in Hobart, Australia's first memorial to the Black War is being built. In honour of the warriors who, armed only with spears and clubs, for years resisted the mightiest empire on earth. Historians Henry Reynolds and Nicholas Clements wrote, "They fought with honour, for freedom, and from love of country. Why have we never heard of them? Why can we not pronounce their names? A few years ago, after a campaign by the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, UNESCO removed from its documents the sentence stating that the Tasmanians are an extinct human race. That sentence had stood there for 41 years. Recently, the Royal Society of Tasmania issued an official apology for its role in, as it wrote, the systematic desecration of Aboriginal remains. Today, on Mount Wukalina, formerly Mount William, a walking trail operates, led by Palawa descendants. Wukalina Walk. Tourists from around the world come to hear the story from the mouths of those who lived it. Traditional landscape burning techniques, the same ones the Palawa used for tens of thousands of years, are now recognized by scientists as crucial in fighting massive bushfires. Australian forestry services are learning from Aborigines what the colonists tried to erase. The Palawa are still here. On the island they call Lutruwita, by the waters they call Trowuna, under a sky where the star Moini still shines above the southern pole. 400 generations of isolation, 4 decades of war, 150 years of lies. They survived. And they remember. If you have made it this far, this story has done its work. Leave a like and subscribe so more stories like this can be told. And in the comments, drop a topic for the next episode, or tell me what you liked, or did not. See you at the next story.